Andrews, and I'm here with the best in the business. It's senior NBA insider Adrian Wojnarowski. And Woj, free agency, it really is in full swing. It's almost time for all of us to hop on a plane, head to Las Vegas for Summer League, but the basketball world is still on Kevin Durant watch. So where does his trade request stand as of right now, this moment today?
Hey, Malika, listen, Brooklyn continues to talk to teams around the league and, try to see, in a lot of scenarios, if there are multiple team deals they could put together to get back the assets that they would want for Kevin Durant, which are immense. You saw, I think, part of the baseline set with the Rudy Gobert trade, and essentially 5 first-round picks, and that would only be, I think, part of the return Brooklyn would want. They want high-level players, perhaps an all-star, and then more players. They think this should look like one of the biggest trade returns in league history because there's never been quite a player like Kevin Durant on the market. And I think as executives get to Vegas this week, a lot are going to arrive in town Thursday, Friday, ahead of the weekend. I think there's an expectation that GMs and team presidents getting in front of each other, Sean Marks being able to visit face-to-face with other GMs, I think that could be helpful in putting deals together.
Well, given that price tag, that asking request is going to be so high, that it is so immense, is there a path here, Woj, where we could see Kevin Durant return to Brooklyn?
Absolutely, especially, Malika, if this drags out and if there's not a deal found here in the next month and it goes into August and you get closer to training camp, Brooklyn, they don't have to take a deal that they don't want to do. They don't have to talk themselves into a deal. But then at the same time, I think Kevin Durant, as he looks at the situation, could he look at it differently over time? That's certainly a possibility. And I think as you look, if you're Kevin Durant and you start to look at the teams that you might land at, and then what those teams might look like after they have to unload so many assets, I think that's why there's no rush in this process. And I think perhaps there'll be a time where there's better communication going on between Brooklyn and Kevin Durant, and maybe that could impact the idea of him returning. But I don't think anybody's counting on it. And I think all sides are, proceeding as though, listen, that Kevin Durant will be traded at some point. But because of the years left on his contract, 4 years on his contract, and the fact that this is the offseason, things can change, they can evolve, there's no question. Maybe at some point the Nets come to Kevin Durant with a trade and say, hey, here's something we're about to do. And he looks at it and says, maybe I'd rather stay here. Now, he doesn't have say. Brooklyn could go forward with it. I just think, Malika, there are a lot of scenarios where certainly Kevin Durant gets moved, but yes, where he could stay because people do change their minds. They change course. And the fact is, he's under contract, and they still have a very talented, pretty talented deep team in Brooklyn that when you look at it up against other teams in the league should be, with Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving playing at a high level, should believe they can play with anybody.
Well, one of those players that is on that team as we stand here in this moment is Kyrie Irving. He opted into that roughly $37 million player option just a couple of weeks ago. How does he factor into how Kevin Durant is weighing his trade request here?
Yeah, and I think that's another consideration Brooklyn has to make about whether it's a positive or negative to move Kyrie Irving either before Kevin Durant or after Kevin Durant. The market is certainly very different for Kyrie Irving, and the Nets have talked with the Lakers, and I believe there's been, back and forth in communication. And, you look at where there's cap space right now. A team like San Antonio could be a facilitator right now in a let's say a Russell Westbrook, Kyrie Irving deal between the teams. They have the cap space. Now you would have to incentivize them at a pretty high level. And I think that's, I think the willingness of the Lakers to incentivize a deal with multiple draft picks, I think that's still, part of the reason, that's a deal that hasn't gone anywhere yet. That can always change. Again, Rob Pelinka, Sean Marks in Vegas this week and moving forward. I'm sure they'll have conversations there. But I do think that's part of the equation for Brooklyn is, again, do they handle the Kevin Durant deal first and then revisit this? And I think the Lakers' motivation, they've looked at other deals. They've continued, I know, to check in on Eric Gordon in Houston. That's certainly a player that interests them. Buddy Hield in Indiana. Different kinds of guards, shooting guards, certainly both of those players, former Rob Pelinka clients, right? Hield, Eric Gordon. So the Lakers are looking out at different scenarios out in the marketplace, but there's no question Kyrie Irving is one of them.
So you mentioned the Lakers, so let's shift to the West if we could here, because DeAndre Ayton's restricted free agency. It appears to be one of the key offseason dominoes that's yet to fall. So what can you tell us about where the Suns stand on Ayton right now?
And Malika, the Kevin Durant talks have probably slowed up. In fact, I'm confident they've slowed up, I think, some of the marketplace for DeAndre Ayton, because teams who would look at sign-in trades, Ayton would impact their ability to do a Durant deal. Teams with salary cap space, who right now could throw an offer sheet or do a sign-in trade with Phoenix. Let's say teams like Indiana, Utah, San Antonio, and all teams, certainly a young center fits into their timeline and their sort of organizational need. But certainly Phoenix knows, listen, I think the worst case scenario for Phoenix is DeAndre Ayton signs a max offer sheet somewhere and they've got to make a decision on matching it. If they match it and keep him, maybe they trade him, which they can't do for a year. But I think in those scenarios, I think for the Suns, it's talk, sign, and trade with teams who have cap space and can threaten to sign them to a sheet, like Indiana, who's getting up there in terms of their ability to throw down a max sheet at DeAndre Ayton, or teams who don't have cap room, who just want to do a sign and trade, and that way Phoenix would get back assets for them. But Phoenix all along has been reluctant to max out DeAndre Ayton. The expectation is he will still find one at some point here in the marketplace. But the Kevin Durant talks, I think, have complicated the timing of DeAndre Ayton, but I think that will pick up again here in the coming days.
So for now, we wait and we head to Las Vegas. Adrian Wojnarowski, thank you so much for your time and for your reporting. So a whole lot of interesting stuff there that Woj shared with us. It really has been an eventful offseason for the Nets thus far. You can take a look at it, but the thing that I want to circle is at the top there. Kyrie Irving opting into that $36.5 million player option, and then obviously Kevin Durant requesting that trade just before the start of free agency on Thursday, acquiring Royce O'Neal, and then agreeing to terms with Patty Mills, Nick Claxton, TJ Warren, Kessler Edwards, and Edmund Sumner. So here now, I want to bring in our Brian Windhorst and Kendrick Perkins. Based on all of what we just heard from Woj, I want to circle back to one thing, this domino of Kevin Durant, waiting for that to fall and impact not only Kyrie Irving, but also, Brian, impact players like DeAndre Ayton. What are you hearing from around the league? What stood out to you from the reporting we just heard?
Yeah, well, from what I understand, I don't think the Nets are thrilled with the offers that they've gotten for Durant yet. I don't think that's a hot take, considering that they're, reassessing with where they're at. And I think the reason is this. It's somewhat known in the NBA that Durant prefers going to the Phoenix Suns. And the Suns' offer and what they have to offer right now just isn't that interesting to Brooklyn. Brooklyn is interested in other things. That's why Woj and others talk about potentially needing a third or fourth team in a deal. And so if you're a team like the Raptors, or, for example, who we've heard about have interest and has had some discussions with Brooklyn, the bar that you have to clear isn't the Nets' expectation. It's what the expectation or what the offer is from the Suns. And so I don't think that the premium offers that I think a lot of us in the media sometimes jump to when we talk about, oh, well, Team A can offer the Nets this, and we list like 4 or 5 beautiful players and asset stuff and swaps and picks and everything. They don't often come out of the gate like that. And that's why if you study history here about superstar trades over the last 10 to 15 years, and we now have a lot of them, especially those trades that happen in the summer, there's 2 things that we often see. One, they tend to take time. They don't happen sometimes in the first week of July, especially when the trade demand comes late. And secondly, they often aren't for the haul that we always assume in the start. And especially as this pertains to the Raptors, Malika, I will refer you to the Kawhi Leonard trade back in 2018. The Raptors and Masai Ujiri, their team president, basically outlasted the market on that. Their offer, while it did have DeMar DeRozan in it, an excellent player, their offer that the Spurs ultimately took was lower than we thought was going to come for Kawhi Leonard. And so it wouldn't surprise me if Masai sticks to that same formula and tries to wait the Nets out. And that's what we're in right now, the waiting game.
Well, you mentioned time, and that's something that's so interesting that Woj reported. Kendrick, you were in these locker rooms. When it comes to waiting, Woj said that, the longer this takes, the more sort of options that Kevin Durant is going to need to weigh, including looking at a team and saying, once all of these players and picks are gone, is this somewhere I want to land, play, and think I can win? How does time, in your eyes, as a player, weigh into all of this?
Oh, it weighs heavy. And we're talking about Kevin Durant, right? And we're talking about the effect that it has on everybody else in the locker room. Like, you're going to start getting to the point where teams are going to start hosting their private workouts. Players are going to get together and start meeting up in certain locations and having their bonding time and things to that nature. You want to get ahead of the curve. Here's the thing that
The NBA world felt shockwaves when the Jazz sent Rudy Gobert to Minnesota in a blockbuster trade for a historic return. When the Jazz got eliminated from the playoffs in April, speculation began on whether the Jazz would break up their all-star duo and enter a rebuild. In our off-season preview for the Jazz, we concluded that they were in good hands for a rebuild under newly hired Danny Ainge because of his history of extracting optimal value in trades. It's possible more trades continue around their other role players. According to Adrian Wojnarowski, the Jazz plan on retooling the roster around Mitchell, suggesting he is off the table for now. Tony Jones of The Athletic confirmed those sentiments and added that the Jazz are active on the trade market, likely in deals involving their other role players. Talks would likely start with their glut of guards, including Mike Conley, Jordan Clarkson, and Nickeil Alexander-Walker. They could also discuss trades for newly acquired Malik Beasley, Patrick Beverley, and Leandro Balmero. It's possible the Jazz could extract a couple more first-round picks for these players and later convert them into better veteran pieces around Mitchell. However, the door may not be completely closed on a Mitchell trade. According to Andy Larson of the Salt Lake Tribune, the Jazz could be keeping their options open, which could include trading Mitchell for a massive haul. After setting the market at 4 unprotected first-round picks for Gobert, who is older and on a bigger contract, Utah will likely command at least a similar package to consider moving Mitchell. There are few teams that have at least 4 tradable first-round picks, and even fewer in that group